They told him not to do it. Not the opposition, not television commentators, not critics on social media. His own advisors inside the White House warned him. The same people who track the economy every morning, the same people who watch the polls move district by district, the same people whose job is to protect his presidency. They looked at the numbers and they said one thing very clearly. Focus on the economy, not Iran. But Donald Trump did not listen. And now something far bigger than a foreign policy decision is unfolding. Because what happened in the last few days is not just about a strike or a military operation somewhere in the Middle East. It is about a calculation. A calculation that some economists believe could cost more than $300 billion before this is over. A calculation that Republican strategists quietly admit could reshape the 2026 midterm elections. And a calculation that may have already triggered a chain reaction across the global economy. The strikes began in late February. The markets reacted almost instantly. Oil traders started watching one location more closely than anywhere else on Earth, the Strait of Hormuz. And inside Washington, something even more dramatic began happening. Behind the scenes, people close to Trump started asking a question they never expected to ask this early in his presidency. Did this decision just change the entire political future of the administration? Stay with me, because what happened next reveals something far more complicated than a simple military operation. To understand how this situation began, you have to go back several days before the strikes. Not to the moment the bombs dropped, but to the moment the warnings started piling up inside Washington. On February 21st, a report from Reuters quietly described a growing divide inside the White House. According to multiple senior sources, several advisors to Donald Trump were urging him to shift his attention away from Iran and back toward the economy. Their reasoning was simple and brutally practical. Inflation had finally started easing, markets were stabilizing, and the administration was preparing to frame the upcoming months around economic recovery. In other words, the political strategy was already set. Focus on jobs. Focus on growth. Focus on affordability. That message had just been reinforced in Trump's most recent major speech, where the administration emphasized economic progress and promised stability ahead. Republican strategists believed that narrative was the winning formula going into the next election cycle. But behind closed doors, something else was happening. Military planning had already begun. Satellite imagery and intelligence assessments were showing unusual activity across several U.S. military installations in the region. Carrier strike groups were moving into position. Strategic bombers were quietly relocated to forward operating bases. And according to reporting from several outlets, the Pentagon had begun preparing what officials described as a full capability package for a potential operation. Inside the administration, that raised an obvious question. If the economy was supposed to be the centerpiece of Trump's political strategy, why was the military suddenly preparing for one of the most aggressive confrontations with Iran in decades? One advisor reportedly gave a blunt answer when speaking privately to reporters. The boss was getting impatient. That impatience mattered because the strategic pressure was building from multiple directions. Israel had been warning for months that Iran's missile program was expanding faster than expected. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had personally visited Washington earlier in the year and reportedly presented U.S. officials with intelligence assessments outlining dozens of potential Iranian targets. At the same time, diplomatic efforts were still technically underway. Trump's son-in-law and advisor Jared Kushner had been involved in back-channel discussions aimed at restarting negotiations with Tehran. Those talks were fragile, but some negotiators believed progress was still possible. So by late February, two completely different strategies were unfolding at the same time. One path was diplomacy. The other was escalation. And according to several insiders, Trump was listening to both sides almost daily, polling advisors, asking questions, changing direction, then reconsidering again. For weeks, the situation remained unresolved. Until suddenly, it wasn't. For a while, the situation inside Washington looked like one of those familiar moments where nothing actually happens. Meetings continue, advisors debate strategy, intelligence reports pile up on the president's desk, and the final decision keeps getting pushed one more day into the future. But sometime in the final week of February, that uncertainty began to disappear. During a public appearance, Donald Trump delivered a short statement about Iran that many people overlooked at the time. He said Iran had a choice to make: negotiate a fair deal or face consequences. Then he added something that in hindsight sounded less like a warning and more like a deadline. "You'll probably find out in about 10 days, he said. At that moment, most observers interpreted the comment as typical political pressure. Trump had used similar language many times before in negotiations. But inside the administration, several officials immediately understood what that timeline actually meant. The military preparations were already in motion. Carrier groups were positioned across the region. Strategic bombers were staged at long-range bases. Intelligence units were monitoring activity around key Iranian facilities. And most importantly, contingency plans were already sitting on the president's desk. The logic behind those preparations was straightforward. If Iran did not produce a proposal that satisfied the White House within the timeframe Trump had suggested publicly, the pressure to act would increase dramatically. This is something many former officials quietly acknowledge about military deployments. Once large amounts of hardware move into position, the political gravity of those deployments becomes difficult to reverse. Pulling back can appear like weakness. Moving forward becomes the easier decision. That dynamic was especially important in this case because of the geography involved. Any serious confrontation with Iran would immediately threaten one of the most important energy corridors on Earth, the Strait of Hormuz. Nearly a fifth of global oil shipments pass through that narrow waterway. Which meant that if the countdown Trump hinted at actually expired without a deal, the consequences would not stay limited to the Middle East. They would spread through financial markets, fuel prices, and eventually into the daily lives of voters thousands of miles away. And then, just days later, the countdown reached zero. The moment the strikes began, something else began happening almost immediately. Not on the battlefield, not in Washington press briefings, but inside financial markets. Traders started doing math. Because wars in the Middle East rarely stay confined to military strategy. They ripple outward through energy markets, shipping lanes, insurance rates, and eventually the price people pay at gas stations. Within hours of the first reports that U.S. forces had begun operations, analysts started asking the same question. What does this actually cost? And the answer, depending on how you calculate it, becomes very uncomfortable very quickly. Start with the direct military expenses. Even a limited air campaign is enormously expensive. Aircraft fuel, precision munitions, surveillance systems, logistics chains, and thousands of personnel operating across multiple bases all add up fast. Defense economists studying similar operations have estimated that a sustained multi-week campaign can run into the tens of billions. But American operations rarely stay limited. The United States operates larger carrier groups, more aircraft, and a much broader support network than almost any other military. That means the cost scale grows quickly. Several defense analysts estimated that the opening phase of operations alone could easily reach $50 billion before the campaign even reaches its midpoint. And that is just the beginning. Because the real financial shock rarely comes from the military budget. It comes from oil. The moment conflict threatens the Persian Gulf, every energy trader on Earth begins watching one location very closely, the Strait of Hormuz. Roughly 15% of the world's seaborne oil supply passes through that narrow waterway. Tankers carrying crude from Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates must pass through it every single day. Iran sits directly along its northern coast. Which means any conflict involving Iran automatically raises a terrifying question for energy markets. What happens if the strait becomes unstable? Even partial disruption can send prices climbing rapidly. Before the strikes, oil had already been trading with what analysts call a geopolitical premium. The possibility of conflict had pushed prices close to $90 per barrel. Once the operation began, traders immediately began pricing in the possibility of further escalation. Some analysts warned that prices above $100 could become the new baseline if tanker traffic slows or insurance costs spike. That scenario alone would ripple across the entire global economy. Think about the numbers involved. The United States consumes roughly 20 million barrels of oil every single day. If global prices rise $40 above their previous baseline, the annual additional cost for the American economy approaches $300 billion. And that is not a theoretical number. That cost appears gradually through gasoline prices, shipping costs, airline tickets, manufacturing expenses, and food distribution. In other words, the impact shows up everywhere. Some economists warned that gasoline prices in the United States could move toward $4 or even $5 per gallon if the disruption persists long enough. That is exactly the kind of economic pressure voters notice immediately. But the shock does not stop at fuel prices. Financial markets react quickly to geopolitical instability. Historically, major conflicts in the Middle East have triggered sharp sell-offs across global stock markets. Investors move capital away from risk and into safer assets, which can wipe trillions of dollars from market valuations almost overnight. Even a modest decline of several percentage points across major indexes could translate into trillions of dollars of lost wealth on paper. That means retirement accounts shrink, pension funds lose value, and consumer confidence begins to weaken. Once that process starts, another risk appears. Inflation. Higher energy prices push up transportation costs, manufacturing costs, and eventually grocery bills. Economists sometimes describe this chain reaction using a word that every central bank fears: stagflation. Stagflation is particularly dangerous because it traps policymakers in an impossible situation. If the central bank raises interest rates to fight inflation, economic growth slows even further. If it lowers rates to stimulate growth, inflation becomes worse. And this is where the political consequences begin creeping into the economic conversation. Because the entire political message surrounding the administration had been built around economic stability. Advisors believed that if voters felt financially secure heading into the next election cycle, the political landscape would remain favorable. But if war suddenly pushes oil higher, triggers market volatility, and revives inflation fears, that message collapses almost overnight. Which is why several analysts quietly started referring to the situation as a political trap. Not because the military operation itself was impossible to justify strategically. Governments make national security decisions all the time. But because of the timing. Launching a confrontation in one of the world's most sensitive energy regions, just as economic stability becomes the central political argument, creates enormous risk. And once that process begins, it becomes very difficult to control. The financial math starts moving faster than the political messaging. Which leads to an uncomfortable question that even some supporters of Donald Trump have begun quietly asking. Did this decision just set off an economic chain reaction that nobody fully calculated beforehand? Because if those energy markets stay unstable long enough, the $300 billion estimate people are talking about today may end up looking conservative. While financial analysts were beginning to run the numbers, something equally important had already been unfolding inside the White House. For weeks leading up to the strikes, two very different arguments were competing for the president's attention. On one side were the officials pushing diplomacy. They believed the economic risks of a military confrontation were simply too high at that particular moment. Inflation had only recently started stabilizing, markets were recovering from earlier volatility, and the administration had spent months trying to convince voters that the economy was finally moving in the right direction. From their perspective, opening a conflict with Iran threatened to undo all of that progress almost instantly. One of the voices reportedly pushing hardest for continued negotiations was Jared Kushner. He had spent months involved in indirect diplomatic channels aimed at reviving a possible agreement with Tehran. Those talks were complicated and fragile, but some negotiators believed a deal was still within reach if both sides were given more time. Their argument was simple. Slow down. Keep negotiating. avoid triggering a regional crisis that could destabilize global energy markets. But there was another side to the debate. Israeli leadership had been warning for months that Iran's missile program and nuclear capabilities were advancing faster than expected. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu reportedly presented U.S. officials with intelligence assessments outlining dozens of Iranian military targets that could potentially be struck. From that perspective, waiting carried its own risks. Supporters of a stronger response argued that Iran had never been more vulnerable strategically. Regional alliances had shifted, intelligence capabilities had improved, and the window to weaken Iranian military infrastructure might not stay open forever. So the decision facing Donald Trump was not a simple yes or no question. It was a choice between two very different kinds of risk. Diplomacy might fail, allowing Iran more time to strengthen its position. But military action could ignite a regional confrontation with unpredictable consequences. According to several reports from officials familiar with the internal discussions, Trump spent days moving back and forth between those arguments. Advisors presented intelligence briefings, economic projections, and political polling data. Meetings stretched late into the night. At times, he appeared convinced diplomacy still had a chance. At other moments, he seemed ready to authorize action immediately. This pattern of hesitation is something people close to Trump have seen before. He often tests arguments aggressively, pushing advisors to defend their positions while he weighs options in real time. But eventually, the debate reaches a point where hesitation disappears. And when that moment comes, decisions happen very quickly. According to officials familiar with the final hours before the operation, once the intelligence community confirmed the location of several high-value targets inside Iran, the timeline changed dramatically. The window to act had opened. And suddenly, the long debate that had lasted weeks was over in a matter of hours. Then it happened. Late on February 28, the operation began. The first reports indicated precision strikes on Iranian military infrastructure, targeting what the White House described as high-value assets. Within hours, multiple sources suggested significant leadership casualties. According to several reports, even figures close to the supreme leader were affected, though details remain partially classified. The immediate military outcome was dramatic. According to U.S. Central Command, the Iranian Navy suffered substantial losses, and air defense capabilities were disrupted across multiple regions. Satellites and surveillance drones captured imagery that confirmed damage to several key sites. But even in the early hours, the consequences extended beyond the battlefield. Oil prices surged almost instantly. Brent crude, already elevated, jumped over 8% in a single session, pushing gasoline futures higher. Analysts warned that if the Strait of Hormuz remained disrupted, crude prices could surpass $100 per barrel, a threshold that would ripple across global economies. Markets reacted with caution bordering on panic. Major stock indices began to fall, as investors anticipated prolonged regional instability. Analysts calculated that a 3 to 7% decline in equity markets could wipe trillions from retirement accounts, pension funds, and other investments. Inside Washington, the political calculus was changing by the hour. Republican strategists, who had previously built plans around economic messaging, now faced a rapidly evolving crisis. Advisors warned that the combination of market volatility, rising fuel prices, and growing public concern could dramatically alter midterm prospects. Even internationally, the effects were visible. Allies and adversaries alike were recalculating their positions. Regional governments began mobilizing contingency measures, and intelligence agencies globally went on high alert. And yet, for Donald Trump, the operation represented a decisive moment, a test of leadership framed as both strategic and political. Some supporters hailed the strikes as bold and necessary. Critics warned of overreach and escalating consequences. This is the part where the story becomes complicated, because even a successful strike carries hidden costs. The removal of key leadership, the destruction of military assets, and the immediate disruption to global trade set off a chain reaction that no advisor could fully control. Suddenly, the political narrative around the presidency shifted. The careful messaging on economic performance, which had been the centerpiece of the administration's strategy for months, now competed with headlines about military escalation and the risks of a regional war. And while the White House tried to frame the action as targeted and contained, the economic, political, and strategic ripples were impossible to ignore. The countdown that began with those early February warnings had ended, and the consequences were already moving faster than anyone had anticipated. With the strikes underway, Republican strategists began calculating more than just military outcomes, they were calculating midterm losses. Before the conflict, the GOP controlled the House with a slim 9-seat majority, 222 to 213. Historical patterns suggest the party in power often loses around 30 seats in the first midterm. That would have been challenging enough. But now, with rising gas prices, inflation fears, and market instability, internal models projected something far worse. 50 seats lost. 60. Possibly even more, enough to give Democrats a commanding House majority. The Senate math was equally precarious. Republicans defend 21 seats in 2026, while Democrats only defend 13. Losing 3 to 5 seats flips control, potentially giving Democrats a working majority. States like Pennsylvania, Ohio, Wisconsin, Arizona, Nevada, and North Carolina, already considered competitive, suddenly became high-risk battlegrounds, especially as voters begin noticing skyrocketing fuel costs and the impact on their savings. Inside the White House, advisors reportedly began private conversations that were never meant for public consumption. One GOP strategist told CNN bluntly, "No one thinks this war is popular. At best, this is a distraction from the economy. And that distraction matters." For weeks, the administration had been framing the narrative around affordability, jobs, and growth, the messaging that was supposed to secure competitive districts. In just a few days, the war narrative supplanted it entirely. But there is more nuance. Not all Republican voters reacted the same. Some viewed the strikes as strong leadership, decisive action that projects U.S. power abroad. Others, particularly suburban families and small business owners, saw immediate personal costs, higher gas bills, 401k losses, and rising inflation in grocery stores. These voters formed the crucial middle of the electorate, precisely the group that had been the linchpin of Trump's prior victories. Meanwhile, Democrats saw an opening. Every news cycle covering oil prices, market volatility, and the economic consequences of the strikes reinforced the message that Republicans may be mismanaging priorities. And the clock is ticking. By November, every consequence of February's decisions, economic and political, will intersect with voters' perceptions. Republican campaigns will have to answer a single, unavoidable question in every debate, every town hall, every interview: why did your party do this? History offers a stark comparison. In 2003, the Iraq War initially boosted presidential approval, but over time, extended conflict, rising costs, and unfulfilled promises of mission success eroded political support. Advisors familiar with that history reportedly warned Trump that Iran carries not only similar risks, but exponentially higher stakes given the $300 billion economic trap that now exists. The question now is not if these midterms will be affected, but how severely. Path 1 offers limited damage. Path 2 threatens a political spiral that could redefine U.S. governance for years. And in true Trump fashion, he seems to believe he can control both the narrative and the outcome. But history, markets, and voters have a way of testing even the most confident presidents. Now that the strikes have happened, the future hinges on one critical factor: how Iran responds. And insiders are describing two possible paths, one optimistic, one catastrophic. Path 1, the contained scenario, assumes Iran's leadership fragments quickly. Revolutionary Guard units fail to coordinate, internal power struggles prevent prolonged retaliation, and the Strait of Hormuz reopens within weeks. Oil prices stabilize, the markets calm, and inflationary pressures remain elevated but manageable. In this scenario, the political damage to Donald Trump and the GOP is real but survivable: a modest loss of House seats, possibly a narrow Senate hold, and a bruised presidency, not a broken one. For that path to succeed, several conditions must align perfectly: no major proxy escalation from Hezbollah, Iraqi militias, or Houthi forces, the Iranian state must collapse faster than it consolidates, and all economic shocks must stabilize before the summer campaign season. It is possible, but analysts from J.P. Morgan, Natixis, and Wood Mackenzie are not betting on it. Path 2, the spiral, is far darker. Iran's remaining power structures do not collapse, they disperse. Revolutionary Guard units execute scorched earth tactics against civilian centers, energy infrastructure, and regional allies. Oil remains above $100 per barrel through the summer. Inflation accelerates, forcing the Federal Reserve into a nearly impossible position. Growth slows to near stagnation, triggering technical stagflation. Gas prices remain elevated heading into November, affecting the daily lives of voters in every competitive district. In Path 2, the political fallout is severe. Every Republican running in swing states faces a single, unavoidable question at every debate and interview: why did your party do this? 50 or more House seats could flip. The Senate could fall entirely. The White House agenda becomes paralyzed, investigations mount, and the next 2 years could resemble a constant crisis management cycle. And yet, Trump reportedly dismisses comparisons to Iraq, convinced that this war will be different. Every president believes their military action is distinct, but history is undefeated. Extended conflict, miscalculated costs, and public frustration have derailed presidencies before. The only difference now is the $300 billion economic trap layered on top, multiplied by global market reactions and domestic political risks. The difference between these paths is not strategy, it is Iran. The behavior of a post-Khamenei Iran is unpredictable, and the consequences of miscalculation could be catastrophic. For voters, markets, and policymakers, the stakes could not be higher. The clock is running. The choices have been made. And now, the world waits to see which path unfolds. Here's where the story gets even more complicated and potentially explosive. Because even in a successful strike scenario, there are consequences that nobody in the White House can fully control. According to multiple reports, the operation did not just hit military targets. Key intelligence suggests that some of Iran's internal security and communication networks were also affected. That creates a vacuum that could be filled in unpredictable ways. Factional disputes within the Revolutionary Guard could lead to proxy attacks across the region, hitting civilian centers, shipping lanes, and energy infrastructure. Here's the twist: even a victory now carries risks for Trump's political standing. Republican strategists admit in private that public perception matters as much as actual military outcomes. Voters are already feeling the pinch: gas prices rising, markets fluctuating, inflation creeping back into daily life. In states like Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Arizona, those personal costs hit hard, and the midterms are less than 9 months away. Another viral point: the intelligence that triggered the operation reportedly came from a narrow window of opportunity, targeting senior Iranian officials gathered in one location. That window closed within hours. If the strike had been delayed by even a day, the leadership could have dispersed, and the political and strategic consequences would have been completely different. The stakes were unusually high, and the risk calculations were enormous. Meanwhile, the global reaction is spreading fast. Allies are scrambling to assess their own exposure. Oil markets are already pricing in prolonged instability. Social media amplifies every development, turning local economic disruptions into national conversations overnight. That's exactly the type of rapid viral feedback loop that can turn any political decision into a trending topic within minutes. And here's the final twist: the very strategy designed to project strength could backfire. Every Republican candidate is now forced to answer the same question in every campaign interaction: why did your party risk the economy and national stability for this operation? Trump's instinct to act decisively may have bypassed traditional political calculations, but the consequences are now multiplying. Each day the conflict continues, each escalation in proxy warfare, each spike in oil and inflation, increases pressure on voters, markets, and the administration itself. This is not just about military strategy. This is about economic impact, voter perception, political survival, and global reputation, all converging in a way that could define Trump's presidency and reshape the 2026 midterms. The question for the audience now is, did this strike secure a strategic advantage, or has it created a crisis that even the most confident president cannot control? Here is where it all comes together. The strikes are over, but the consequences are just beginning to unfold. For Donald Trump, the choice to act on Iran was a gamble of unprecedented scale. On one hand, a decisive action could project strength, disrupt Iranian capabilities, and potentially reshape regional dynamics in America's favor. On the other, the economic, political, and social costs could spiral out of control, threatening both his presidency and the Republican Party's prospects in November. The $300 billion economic floor, combined with potential market collapses, inflation spikes, and disrupted energy supplies, is just the beginning. Every day the conflict continues, every proxy escalation, every delay in reopening the Strait of Hormuz adds pressure. And voters notice. Gas prices, 401k statements, and grocery bills are more tangible than strategy memos or political polling numbers. Republican strategists now face a reality they had hoped to avoid, two very different futures, both hinging on the unpredictable behavior of Iran's post-Khamenei state. Path 1 offers a contained, survivable outcome. Path 2, a spiral that could redefine American politics, markets, and foreign relations. And history shows that presidents often underestimate the consequences of war, no matter how confident they feel in their calculations. This is where you, the audience, come in. This isn't just news, it's a debate about leadership, risk, and accountability. Did Trump make a historic mistake, or is the short-term political cost worth the long-term strategic gain? Will the conflict end in weeks or expand in ways that no advisor can fully anticipate? And when the dust settles, which party and which country truly emerges stronger? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Every perspective matters. Analysts will crunch numbers, politicians will spin narratives, but your insights reflect how this story is shaping public perception right now. If this analysis is making sense, hit like and subscribe to Daily Brief. The story is moving fast and there's more coming. Updates on the economic fallout, voter reactions, and insider perspectives from Washington are just around the corner. Stay informed. Stay engaged. And most importantly, keep watching, because the decisions made in February are going to reverberate for months and possibly years to come.